When the British first arrived, India meant the riches of the East. The court of its Mughal rulers made the England of Queen Elizabeth seem provincial. To the Indians, the early British were pirates and conquering barbarians. Delhi, 1939. 2 months after Britain declared war on Germany, the eldest daughter of India's viceroy was getting married. Many felt the celebration, in public at least, should be restrained. Lord Linlithgow, the viceroy, the man who ruled India, took a different view.
The king in Buckingham Palace said there would be no drinks during the war, and austerity was sort of clamped down on the British, as far as we could gather from the newspapers, from the minute the war began. Here in India, we were being encouraged to go on just the same as before, and we had this vice-regal wedding, and we had this scene of great pomp and splendor. It was meant to impress the Indians with the fact that we weren't frightened, which was a matter of deliberate policy, but it did shock me. It was seen as a great luxury, as the vice-regal occasions always were.
India, 1/5 of humanity, the biggest possession ever held by any empire, itself shaped much of imperial policy. The government of India was every bit as majestic, on occasions nearly as powerful, as the government in Britain. India was the second pillar of the empire. At the wedding, the talk was about the European war. The old white dominions chose to join the Allies. Linlithgow announced India was at war without consulting one of her 400 million people. Unasked, India was at war with Germany.
Linlithgow must be admired, I think, for his courage in sticking to his guns and saying that he would continue just as though nothing had happened. You see, a stiff upper lip, the policy of a stiff upper lip. And it was magnificent. Perhaps, as in the old phrase, magnificent but not war.
As the young couple left the imperial palace, modestly called Viceroy's house, though bigger than Versailles, the honeymoon between Britain and India's elite had long been over. Imperial Britain had promised a free and united India. By 1939, India was already halfway along the road to independence, supervised by only a thin line, the Indian Civil Service, down to just 600 Britons. Indian ministers ran the 11 provinces of British India, nearly 2/3 of the country. The war in Europe changed imperial priorities. Britain now had only one purpose, her own defense and that of her empire. But for Indians, the war posed a cruel dilemma. Wedged between Nazism and imperialism, they felt that the path to independence was blocked on either side.
Some of them would not have minded Hitler winning. Most of them would not have liked it. But they didn't see why they should be the fall guys who were to support one imperialism against another. And so the purely nationalist feeling, a plague on both your houses, was of the ascendant, I thought. People were not pro or anti-Hitler, they were for freedom.
Since the 1920s, the symbol of Indian freedom had been the puckish figure of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the Pied Piper of the 4 million strong Congress Party. The Mahatma, the great soul, though trained as a barrister in London, was Indian in everything else. Congress, India's largest independence movement, had, till Gandhi joined, been a westernized middle-class party. Gandhi changed all that. Congress became a mass party. Swaraj, self-rule, became his slogan. Civil disobedience, his weapon. Gandhi spent as much time at prayer as he did at politics. In a few years, he turned Congress back to the ancient culture of India's 300 million Hindus. He opposed modern technology. The spinning wheel was his symbol. Gandhi's vision of a free India was rural, conservative, and in essence, religious.
I want to predict that story with what I want to see. That if you really want to see India at its best, you have to find it in a cottage, in a humble home.
But behind the scenes, Gandhi was backed by India's richest men. While he fought for the downtrodden, he defended India's caste system. He recruited soldiers in the First World War, then turned pacifist. Millions hailed him as a saint. Most British called him a troublemaker. Some thought he was mad. Wiser officials welcomed Gandhi's pacifism. They saw it as a break on Congress hotheads. The empire preferred non-violence to revolution.
Gandhi's main precept was, hate imperialism, but not the imperialists. They're nice people. So don't kill them, don't hate them. Have a regard for them, but tell them you're doing something wrong, and I'm going to stop you doing it. It's the action that is wrong, not the people.
In November 1939, the same month as the wedding, Congress forced their ministers in the provinces to resign. They demanded that Britain concede immediate independence. The British were secretly pleased. Without interfering congressmen, they could run the war in their own way. But Gandhi's view of the war was a mystery. His blend of Hindu mysticism and practical politics was a purely Gandhian cocktail.
It was unique. He lived on these two dimensions at once. The moment he started to get a little bit, as it were, bewildered or mixed up in politics, he retreated at once into mysticism, you see. And that was his inevitable get-out. Now, this isn't to say that I didn't deeply admire him. I think he was probably one of the really significant figures of the 20th century. But at the same time, he'd got this tremendously unique get-out. He lived in two worlds at the same time, and he could nip from one to the other at the drop of a hat if he'd ever had a hat.
His followers, like Nehru, did have hats, Gandhi caps. By 1939, Nehru was number 2 to Gandhi.
Women act as stewards at a political meeting on Bombay's Maidan, and the speaker is the Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, product of Harrow and Cambridge.
Nehru differed sharply from Gandhi. Non-religious, Western and progressive, he was for the Allies. But Gandhi still dominated Congress. Nehru could only make speeches against the dictators. Some Indians wondered where Nehru's sympathy did lie.
My brother, of course, all his views were tinged with his background, his knowledge of the English, his desire to certainly participate in the ending of imperialism, but not to create any sort of bitterness or situation which would damage friendship ultimately and so on.
Was there a feeling that perhaps Nehru, for some of them, had too much of the West in him?
Oh, with all of them. They all thought that. I think every one of them at some time or the other thought that Nehru had more than was necessary of the West in him.
When the war came, there was no doubt about Nehru or his family's sympathy.
My father saw fascism and Nazism not merely as they were affecting the Jews or the leftists or somebody in Europe, but as the shadow would fall on the world as a whole. So he saw our problems in that larger setting, always, whether it were economic problems or the political problems. In this, he differed, because most of the other Indian leadership tended to see just the Indian side of it. They were not too much concerned about what was happening abroad.
Some saw the war as their chance to seize power. Nehru would hear none of it, nor would his colleague, Maulana Azad. Azad and Nehru led the anti-fascists. They wanted a deal with Britain. Help in the war for independence when it was over. They tried to persuade Congress, but Gandhi, the pacifist, said no.
They were talking about violence and non-violence and the ethics of war and all the rest. And Gandhi was sitting on the ground, and Azad, who had some trouble with his knees, he always used to sit on a chair. He was sitting, and while putting his hand on Gandhi's head, he said, "इस फिक्र में बैठा हूँ, आखिर मुझे क्या करना? इस दिल से जुदा होना या दिलबर से जुदा होना?" He said, "I am sitting confused. What am I to do? Should I leave my beloved, or should I leave the calling of my heart? That the inside, the feeling is to go to war and not to bother about violence and non-violence. But if I do decide anything contrary to non-violence, then I lose my beloved." That was Gandhi.
While Congress argued, the British priority was clear. Over 1 million Indians had fought in the First World War. Now, whether Gandhi approved or not, that effort was doubled.
India expanded her army from less than 200,000 to over 2.5 million. This is the largest volunteer army in the world. It could be larger still, so far as the men are concerned. There's been no shortage of volunteers, but only of equipment and instructors to train them.
In London, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. A passionate imperialist, for years he had fought to keep India under British rule. For Churchill, India's job was to help win the war. Gandhi he despised. He would make no deal with Congress, that Hindu priesthood he called them. Churchill's only concern was for men and supplies from India. The Oriental barracks in an eastern sea. Despite Gandhi, Congress followed Nehru. They offered Britain a deal. When Churchill turned them down, Congress went off in a huff. Churchill knew he could simply take India's resources for the war. Part of his plan was to use the princely states, whose survival depended on the British. The princes had given up effective power. In return, Britain allowed them to run nearly a third of India. A few were modern and progressive. Some were little more than local dictators. The British could count on them to parade and give cash and men. Like medieval barons, they lorded it over some of the most backward areas in the country. Some ruled little more than a village. The princely state of Hyderabad was as big as Spain. The princes were afraid of Congress, and most of them banned it from their states. They hoped the British would stay in India to protect them. The British found them admirably loyal.
The Indian princes were making a positive contribution to the war, and there were other people besides the Congress who could speak for India. Congress was a very important party, but they made the great mistake of insisting that they spoke for the whole of India.
Not only the princes rejected Congress, the Muslims felt the same, and there were 90 million of them. They had not taken to Western education as readily as the Hindus. They were afraid the 300 million Hindus would beat them at the game of competitive examinations and ballot boxes. With Britain at war, the Muslims were now vital to Churchill's plans. Muslims were nearly a third of the army, and to most British officials, easy to get on with.
Many people did have this feeling with Muslims. I think probably more people felt more at home with Muslims. It was easier, of course, because you could eat with Muslims. I mean, they would ask one out for a meal, and you could go and eat with them. And it was only, of course, with a Hindu who'd been to England or who'd become a barrister or something of that kind, that you could really sit down and eat the same way. I had Hindu friends in one village I remember very vividly, where they always used to ask me to a meal, but they stood around and watched, and they didn't eat with you.
The rulers of India before the British came were Muslim. They dreamed of past glories and of the day when the British would go and they could revive a Muslim empire. All over India, Hindus worshipped the sacred cow. The Muslims killed and ate them. In the towns and villages, people drank Muslim water and Hindu water.
We were so far apart that although we lived next door to each other, we didn't intermarry, we didn't eat together, we were not called to each other's ceremonies. Our heroes, the heroes of one were, so to speak, the villains of the other. And so, we became quite distinct. We were socially distinct. Although it took a long time, it was an ambiguous situation because for 700 years the Muslims ruled. And so a Muslim in India did not really quite know whether he's basically a Muslim or an Indian.
To face this problem, Muslims had set up a political party of their own, the Muslim League. They asked for and got protection, separate voting rights from Hindus. This was bitterly opposed by Congress. To them, the British had formalized a religious divide and made it part of the law. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a most unusual Muslim, thoroughly westernized. As a young man, he backed a united India under Congress. He supported Hindu-Muslim marriages. But Jinnah felt Gandhi was turning Congress into a Hindu party. He had hoped to achieve high office in the movement, but Gandhi outshone him. When his effort to build a bridge between Congress and the League was rejected, he quit Indian politics. Jinnah left Congress and India and settled in England, far removed from Gandhi and his peasant loincloth. In 1936, the Muslim League invited him back to be their leader. Jinnah, still nursing deep resentment of Congress, came home to claim his place in India.
Man had gone through a lot of ups and downs in life. A man who gets married, and within 2 days of marriage, before marriage is consummated, he goes to England and he hears that his wife had died of fever. Then what happens? He hears that his father has gone bankrupt. He's an honest man, he's a upright fellow, he wants to pay every penny of his father's debtors. Came and took a job as presidency magistrate, didn't suit him, walked down the corridors of Bombay High Court till he became a leading lawyer. And he paid every single penny of his father's debt. Then he fell in love with a girl, got married to her. They were estranged after 2 years. And when they made up in Paris, within 2 days she died in his arms. Then he comes back, he sees how Muslims have been treated by his old friends, the Congress Hindus. He was completely shaken man. And he was a disappointed man, completely disappointed.
Here was a man who put on a mask, this thin, elegant dandy, who rose to his feet and began to speak very quietly, so that everybody listened to him. And everybody sort of leaned forward, and listening hard as they could to hear him, but he would hardly raise his voice at all. It was great arrogance, really, but it's an effective arrogance. And in slow, incisive terms, he would put his point across.
But I was talking to him once, and there he was talking about high politics and so on. And then, quite abruptly, he stopped talking and literally went very quite pale and said, "You'll have to excuse me for a moment." And I truly thought he'd been taken ill, because he rose and he left the room, and in 5 minutes he came back full of beans, full of bonhomie, and said, "That fool of a bearer of mine put the wrong cufflinks in my shirt." And that had totally thrown him. So that was a strange sort of superficiality about the man, in a way.
By the start of the war, Jinnah had become a stern enemy of Congress. He feared the British were going to hand over the Muslims to majority rule under Congress and Gandhi. He saw that as dangerously Hindu. Once he had been called the ambassador of Muslim-Hindu unity. Now he proclaimed that the Muslims of India were a separate nation. Why had Jinnah changed?
I think I can best answer that by telling you of an occasion when I dined in company with him at a friend's house. He said, "You British, you're interesting people. As long as it's just a question of administration, you run a country well. When it comes to the business of understanding local movements, local feelings, communal feeling, national feeling, you haven't a clue." He said, "You talk about preserving the unity of India. There never is and never has been any unity in India at all, except the beneficial unity that you forced on us for the time being. You're dreaming when you talk about the unity of India."
Jinnah wanted power. To get it, he had to unite the Muslims behind the League. Islam in Danger was his answer to Gandhi's Hindu appeal. For both sides, religion would bring in the masses. Jinnah revitalized the Muslim League, and the British, faced by a hostile Congress, were ready to play along with him.
although the Muslims never gave official support as a Muslim League to the war effort, in practice they did help in the war effort, whereas the Congress, which meant the great body of the Hindu people, didn't. And therefore the British naturally regarded the one as friends and the other as hostile.
By 1940, Jinnah and the Muslim League were on the move. In the last provincial election 3 years before, they captured only 5% of the Muslim vote. The League needed a touch of Gandhi's magic, a political slogan to inspire the Muslims. Jinnah found it, an idea thrown up by a Muslim student at Cambridge 10 years earlier. The name Pakistan contained the first letters of the areas to be included in the new Muslim homeland Jinnah wanted carved out of India. Pakistan would include P for Punjab, A for Afghania, called Northwest Frontier by the British, K for Kashmir, S for Sindh, and Tarn from Baluchistan. Pakistan. To this, Jinnah added 2 other provinces, Bengal and Assam. The League first demanded Pakistan, the partitioning of India, at Lahore in March 1940. The Muslims, the League argued, were not Indians, but a separate nation. They needed their own state to protect them from a Hindu Raj.
Once Pakistan cry had been raised, there was always the danger that unless some alternative was put forward, everybody would swing towards Pakistan, because it had an enormous appeal to the Muslim masses. In fact, we had foreseen in 1940, when the Pakistan resolution was first put forward, that if it was not stopped early, it would become unstoppable. We should, if possible, have found some alternative to lay before them and let them know very clearly that Pakistan, of Jinnah's conception, was not on and never would be on.
Many British dismissed the Pakistan demand as simply a political gimmick. Some thought it just propaganda by the League, or a tactic to boost Jinnah's popularity. It was both. Pakistan was to become Jinnah's rallying cry. Just how powerful he and the Pakistan idea would be, few could then imagine.